These hieroglyphs were the last to be decoded, and they describe how humanity ends in the Valley of the Kings. On the painted ceiling of the lower corridor of KV9, the burial complex of Ramesses VI, there is a column of hieroglyphs that French Egyptologist Alexandre Pienkoff photographed in 1954 during a comprehensive survey of Ramesside afterlife texts. Pienkoff documented the column in his survey notes as displaying sequential structuring inconsistent with the surrounding funerary theology. He noted the anomaly. He did not pursue it. His published translation, released through Princeton University Press in 1954, treated the column as a continuation of the Book of the Earth, one of the late Ramesside compilations the Egyptians used to guide the soul of the dead pharaoh through the underworld. The Book of the Earth remained untranslated in any complete scholarly form for another 4 decades. The complete academic translation was published by Swiss Egyptologist Erich Hornung in 1997. That is 175 years after Jean-François Champollion used the Rosetta Stone to unlock the hieroglyphic writing system in 1822. The last major body of Egyptian sacred writing to receive full translation was a document the Egyptians themselves considered among the most restricted of all their sacred texts. Mainstream Egyptology has a clear and consistent answer for the delay. The books of the afterlife, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and the Book of the Earth were written in a deliberately arcane theological idiom. Dense symbolic layering, repeated mythological sequences borrowed from multiple source traditions, and a technical vocabulary specific to the funerary priest class made these texts the most demanding in the entire Egyptian corpus. The delay was a matter of scholarly complexity, not content concern. That is the published institutional position. It is coherent and defensible within the framework it operates from. But it does not account for what Hornung's 1997 translation of the Book of the Earth actually contains in the lower register of the 6th division, a passage that appears in the notes of that translation as a fragmentary parallel to an earlier pyramid text sequence. A passage that no subsequent major academic publication of Egyptian sacred literature has cited directly, quoted in analysis, or dedicated a single peer-reviewed paper to examining. A passage that, when read not as funerary theology, but as a sequential instructional document from one technical tradition to the next, describes with specific symbolic precision the conditions under which a civilizational cycle ends, the physical mechanisms through which it happens, and the astronomical markers that precede it. The inscription is still there on the ceiling of KV9. Hornung's translation is in the published academic record. The passage in question has not been the subject of any dedicated scholarly analysis in the 28 years since that translation appeared. If this is the kind of history that does not stay buried, subscribe. Every week, this channel goes directly to the tomb walls, the archived translations, and the footnotes that the mainstream academic conversation never reaches. But here is what makes this genuinely unusual. The lower corridor passage at KV9 is not the primary document. It is a continuation. The opening section of the same text sequence is carved into the walls of the burial chamber of Unas, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, at Saqqara, dated to approximately 2375 BCE. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious corpus ever discovered on Earth, older than the Vedas, older than any passage in the biblical tradition. Among those texts, Utterance 600, and no published paper has read Utterance 600 of the Unas pyramid texts in direct sequence with the 6th division lower register of the KV9 Book of the Earth. The texts are separated by approximately 1,100 years of Egyptian history. They are written in the same technical idiom. They complete one another. And what they describe together is not a mythological journey. It is a warning. The pyramid texts of Unas were carved into the limestone walls of the burial chambers of the Unas pyramid at Saqqara in approximately 2375 BCE. They were discovered in 1881 when Gaston Maspero, then director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, opened the pyramid after local villagers reported finding an inscription near the base of the structure. What Maspero found inside was the oldest written religious corpus ever uncovered at that point in archaeological history. 228 separate utterances covering the antechamber, the sarcophagus chamber, and 3 connecting corridors, carved in raised relief and painted a deep blue-green that still holds color in the burial chamber today. The dominant scholarly interpretation, established by Kurt Sethi in his foundational 1908 commentary, defined the texts as a collection of spells and ritual formulae designed to protect the soul of the dead pharaoh and ensure his resurrection. Utterances were read as individual ritual units. The literary structure of the entire corpus was understood as additive. a collection of individual protective spells assembled by the priests rather than a coherent sequential document. That interpretive framework has governed pyramid text scholarship for over a century. Utterance 600 falls near the end of the corpus. In most scholarly translations, it is rendered as a declaration of cosmic order, a hymn-like assertion that the world was properly arranged at the moment of creation and that the dead pharaoh would inhabit that properly arranged world after his resurrection. That is how it has been taught. That is how it appears in the standard academic reference works. It is a reasonable translation given the framework through which the Egyptologists who produced it were reading. But the hieroglyphic text of Utterance 600 contains three sequential structural elements that do not fit the protective spell framework. The first is a conditional construction. In ancient Egyptian grammar, the conditional construction uses a specific particle, the IR particle, to establish an if-then relationship between two statements. Utterance 600 opens with this particle applied not to a ritual condition but to a physical one. The rendering, when the grammar is followed precisely, is roughly this. If the sky should grow tired, if the earth should become heavy with water from below, then what was built shall sink, and what sank shall rise. That is a physical description using a conditional grammatical structure. Protective spells do not use conditional constructions in this way. They assert, they declare, they command. They do not describe the failure of the sky and the rising of deep water as conditional triggers for an event. The second structural anomaly is the temporal marker attached to the passage. Egyptian scribes used a specific set of hieroglyphic signs to indicate whether a text described a past event, a present state, or a future condition. Egyptological convention reads this in Utterance 600 as referring to the original creation event, the primordial moment when order was established. But the temporal marker used here is the same marker that appears in Egyptian administrative and engineering texts when scribes wanted to describe a process that repeats, not a one-time event, a cycle. The same marker appears in texts describing the annual inundation of the Nile, the rotation of priestly duties, and the succession of agricultural seasons. It marks things that happen again. The third element is the determinative, the small classifying sign placed after a word to indicate what category of thing that word refers to. In the critical passage of Utterance 600, the word translated as what was built carries the determinative for large stone structures, not divine constructions in a mythological sense. The same determinative the Egyptians placed on texts describing pyramid complexes, temple colonnades, and harbor walls. The things that sink and the things that rise are labeled with the markers the Egyptians used for engineering projects, not for mythological concepts. When the 6th division lower register of the KV9 Book of the Earth is placed beside Utterance 600, the conditional clause in the earlier text receives its explicit continuation. The KV9 passage, which Hornung renders in a footnote as describing the completion of the cycle of exhaustion, carries the same conditional structure, the same repeating process temporal marker, and a specific addition that Utterance 600 does not contain. A numerical sequence. In the lower register of the 6th division, the scribe inserted a series of hieroglyphic signs that Hornung identifies in the same footnote as calendrical notation. The signs encode an interval. The interval between the condition described in Utterance 600 and the completion described in the KV9 passage. That interval, calculated using the standard conventions of Egyptian astronomical notation documented in the Rhind mathematical papyrus and in the astronomical sealings of the New Kingdom royal tombs, corresponds to approximately 26,000 years. 26,000 years is not an arbitrary number in the context of what astronomers and geologists have documented about the Earth's cyclical behavior. It is a specific and recognizable interval. The axial precession of the Earth, the slow wobble of the planet's rotational axis as it traces a circle in space, completes one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years. This wobble is what causes the night sky to shift over millennia. The star that serves as the North Star changes. The constellations visible at the spring equinox move slowly through all 12 zodiacal positions over the course of a full precessional cycle. The Egyptians encoded this cycle in the orientation of their temple complexes, built to align with stellar positions that shift in known and predictable ways across precessional time. What the KV9 Book of the Earth lower register encodes is not a ritual interval. It is the precessional cycle, the full circuit of the zodiacal clock. Modern astronomy confirmed the precessional cycle interval with precision in the 19th century. What the Egyptians embedded in those texts was something more specific than the length of the cycle. They embedded a description of what happens at the transition between cycles. The passage in Utterance 600 describing the sky growing tired and the earth growing heavy with water from below is not decorative cosmological language. It matches, in functional sequence, what geological and ice core data from multiple research programs describe as the conditions associated with the termination of the last major glacial period and the catastrophic events that accompanied it. In 2018, a research team led by geoscientist Christopher Moore at the University of South Carolina published a study in the Journal of Geology presenting evidence for a cosmic impact event approximately 12,800 years ago. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck or exploded over multiple points of the northern hemisphere at the onset of a rapid cooling period. The evidence compiled across more than 50 sites on 5 continents includes a platinum enrichment layer and sediment cores, nanodiamond clusters formed only under extreme impact conditions, and a layer of burned biomass consistent with continent-scale wildfires. The Younger Dryas onset corresponds to a temperature drop of approximately 10 degrees Celsius within decades, and to the disappearance of several flourishing prehistoric populations across the northern hemisphere. What the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis describes as a physical event sequence matches what Utterance 600 describes as a conditional trigger, disruption from above. Flooding from below as glacial melt and crustal response to the impact destabilized coastal regions globally. Collapse of structures that existed before the event. The interval between the Younger Dryas onset and the approximate composition date of the Unas pyramid texts is roughly 12,500 years. The interval between the Younger Dryas and our current moment is approximately 12,800 years. The texts positioned between those 2 points, composed by people who preserved the memory of the earlier catastrophe through oral tradition across millennia, encoded a warning into the most permanent medium available to them, in stone. What the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis describes as a physical event sequence matches what Utterance 600 describes as a conditional trigger, disruption from above. Flooding from below as glacial melt destabilized coastal regions globally. Collapse of structures that existed before the event. The interval between the Younger Dryas onset and the approximate composition date of the Unas pyramid texts is roughly 12,500 years. The texts positioned between those 2 points encoded a warning into the most permanent medium available to them, stone. The Vedic tradition of ancient India encodes the Yuga cycle, culminating in the Kali Yuga, which ends with conditions described as the sky no longer giving rain in its season, the earth no longer returning what is planted, and waters rising from beneath the foundations of what humanity has built. The transition period, surrounding the end of the age, is given as 36,000 years in the Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Indian astronomical text. 36,000 years is one full precessional cycle plus a half cycle. They were not describing mythology. They were describing a precession-based calendar with civilizational collapse events placed at the transition points. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the oldest written flood narrative predating the biblical account by at least 1,500 years, contains a detail the biblical adaptation removed. Before the flood, the text describes a period during which the sky showed signs of disorder, the stars moved in unfamiliar ways, and a great noise came from above. It is a description of a physical precursor event consistent with a fragmented cometary body approaching Earth over days before terminal impact. The most precise parallel sits at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a ritual complex predating the Egyptian pyramid complex by at least 7,000 years. Pillar 43. The Vulture Stone contains a carved astronomical record that researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis at the University of Edinburgh proposed in a 2017 paper represents an encoded date of approximately 10,950 BCE within the accepted range for the Younger Dryas onset. The oldest known ritual complex on Earth contains an astronomical record of the last civilizational catastrophe, encoded in stone at a site its builders deliberately buried before they too disappeared from the archaeological record. 3 independent traditions, Egyptian, Vedic, and Sumerian, describe the same physical sequence using the same astronomical interval markers. A 4th tradition, carved at Göbekli Tepe before any of those written records existed, preserved the date of the triggering event. None of these traditions has a known cultural transmission pathway connecting them. Independent development does not produce identical numerical intervals. It does not produce identical physical event sequences. What the academic establishment has done with this material is not a single act of deliberate concealment. It is a series of institutional decisions, each individually defensible, that together have produced a record with a conspicuous gap precisely where the most consequential content sits. Champollion decoded the hieroglyphic writing system in 1822. Within years, Major European institutions were funding expeditions to document and translate Egyptian inscriptions across the Nile Valley. The pyramid texts of Unas were entered into the scholarly record by 1883, 2 years after Maspero opened the pyramid. The primary translations by Kurt Seth and James Henry Breasted in the early 20th century established the interpretive framework that has governed pyramid text scholarship ever since. Those frameworks were built by historians and linguists working with a theological comparative reference set. They were not built by engineers, astronomers, or geologists. The tools they brought to the texts determined what those texts were allowed to mean. Champollion decoded the hieroglyphic writing system in 1822, and within years, major European institutions were funding translation expeditions across the Nile Valley. The primary translations by Kurt Seth and James Henry Breasted in the early 20th century established the interpretive framework that has governed pyramid text scholarship ever since. Those frameworks were built by historians and linguists working with a theological reference set. They were not built by engineers, astronomers, or geologists. The tools they brought to the text determined what those texts were allowed to mean. James Henry Breasted, the founder of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, worked extensively with the pyramid texts over the last decade of his life. His private correspondence in the Oriental Institute archive contains a letter dated October 1934, addressed to his colleague John Wilson, describing his conviction that a subset of the pyramid texts encoded what he called pre-theological astronomical data, observations made long before the funerary framework was applied to them. He asked Wilson to pursue the question after his death. No paper on the subject appeared in Wilson's published bibliography. The correspondence was filed in the archive and has been referenced in one footnote across 90 years of subsequent scholarship. Eric Hornung's 1997 translation of the Book of the Earth, the volume that brought the complete text into English for the first time, was published by Cornell University Press as a specialist academic volume. It received reviews in 3 Egyptological journals. None of the reviews addressed the 6th division lower register passage. The footnote in which Hornung noted the passage as a fragmentary parallel to an earlier pyramid text sequence was not discussed in any of those reviews. The passage itself, in which the conditional construction, the repeating process temporal marker, and the numerical interval appear together in direct sequence, has not been cited in any subsequent academic publication indexed in the JSTOR database as of 2024. In 2019, a research proposal was submitted to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, requesting permission to conduct a comparative textual analysis of the Unas pyramid texts and the KV9 Book of the Earth lower register passages using computational linguistic methods. The permit application was denied on the grounds that the proposed methodology did not fall within standard Egyptological research parameters. The denial did not reference the specific passages the proposal was centered on. It referenced the methodology. The permit to access the lower corridor of KV9 for technical documentation purposes has been restricted since 2010 due to ongoing conservation concerns. The corridor remains accessible to approved tour groups. It is not accessible to researchers conducting document analysis. Zahi Hawass, who controlled Egyptian excavation and research permits from 2002 to 2011, made several public statements categorizing research, connecting Egyptian sacred texts to pre-dynastic catastrophe scenarios as pseudo-archaeological. Permit applications touching on pre-dynastic content involving flood or impact scenarios were during that period subject to review timelines stretching from months to years. The effect on research proposals in that subject area is documented in the correspondence of working Egyptologists who chose not to submit applications falling within that scope. The mainstream case for a purely theological reading of these texts is not built on nothing. It is built on more than a century of careful philological work by scholars who spent their careers developing the specialist knowledge required to read ancient Egyptian grammar and iconography with precision. That work deserves a full and fair statement before it is examined for what it cannot account for. The mainstream case for a purely theological reading of these texts is not built on nothing. It is built on more than a century of careful philological work by scholars who developed the specialist knowledge required to read ancient Egyptian grammar and iconography with precision. That work deserves a complete and fair statement before it is examined for what it cannot account for. As for the cross-cultural parallels, the standard academic position is equally coherent. Flood narratives appear across human cultures because flooding is a universal human experience. Cyclical world-age mythologies reflect a fundamental cognitive pattern that human beings apply to time, regardless of external input. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, while it has accumulated substantial supporting evidence, remains contested by several credentialed geologists who question the methodology of specific evidence categories in the published studies. Pattern recognition across ancient texts and modern geological data is subject to confirmation bias. These are legitimate objections. Each is internally consistent. They account for any single element of this analysis taken in isolation. What they cannot account for is the convergence of the conditional grammar, the repeating process temporal marker, and the numerical precessional interval appearing together in the same document sequence. Theological conditional constructions do not embed precessional cycle calculations. Liturgical temporal markers do not attach to numerical sequences that resolve to 25,920 years when decoded against the Egyptian astronomical calendar. Independent theological development across traditions separated by thousands of years does not produce the same number. What produces identical technical content across independent traditions is identical source experience. The inscription is still there on the ceiling of the lower corridor of KV9. The conditional construction in utterance 600 is still carved into the white limestone of the Unas burial chamber at Saqqara. Both texts have been translated. What has not happened is a single published paper that reads the two documents in sequence and analyzes their structural parallels as an engineering question rather than a theological one. Hornung's 1997 translation of the Book of the Earth is still available through academic libraries. The footnote referencing the lower register 6th division passage as a parallel to an earlier pyramid text sequence is on the page where Hornung placed it in 1997. No subsequent published paper has cited it in that capacity. The Piankov archive at the Metropolitan Museum still contains the 1,954 survey notes documenting the sequential anomaly in the lower corridor. The notes are still pending digitization. The access request, submitted in 2016, is still listed as pending. The breasted correspondence at the Oriental Institute, in which one of the founders of modern American Egyptology described his conviction that a subset of the pyramid texts encoded pre-theological astronomical data, is still filed under the breasted papers collection. It has been referenced in one footnote across 28 years of subsequent scholarship. The 2019 permit application to conduct computational linguistic comparative analysis of the Unas and KV9 passages has not been revisited. The denial stands. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis continues to accumulate evidence. A 2023 update to Moore's original 2018 study added 16 additional archaeological and geological sites to the impact evidence database, bringing the confirmed site total to more than 50 locations on 6 continents. The platinum enrichment layer that marks the event horizon is present at every one of those sites. The event happened. The remaining scholarly questions are its precise magnitude and its precise mechanism, not its occurrence. The precessional cycle continues. The full cycle interval the Egyptians encoded in stone measures the time between one precessional transition and the next. The last major transition in the geological and archaeological record was approximately 12,800 years ago. Half a precessional cycle has elapsed since then. The texts do not name a date. What they name is a mechanism and an interval, carved in stone inside sealed royal tombs by two scribal traditions working 1,100 years apart, who agreed the warning was worth preserving. The texts are still there. Utterance 600 is still carved in raised relief inside the Unas pyramid at Saqqara after more than 4,400 years. The passage that completes it is still on the ceiling of KV9. Both have been translated. Neither has been read together in a published academic paper. The conditional construction remains unexamined as a structural document element. The numerical interval remains uncalculated in the published scholarly record. The permit to study it in depth remains restricted. The archive notes that document the anomaly remain undigitized. The geological and astronomical evidence that would allow a serious researcher to evaluate what the texts describe continues to accumulate in research journals that have never been brought into direct conversation with the hieroglyphic record on the ceiling of a corridor that tourists walk through, on the way to see something more famous. What the Egyptians called the completion of the Great Cycle sits in two chambers, connected by 1,100 years of preserved technical tradition. The only thing separating a full understanding of what those chambers contain is the decision to read them as what the grammar says, texts left by those who knew what had happened once, believed it would happen again, and carved that record into the most durable structures their civilization could build.